Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. So good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you're logging in from. It could even be good morning. Um, my name is Dr. Reggie Taylor, and I'm from the Office of Research and Doctoral Services. And one of the resources that or services that we provide is quantitative training. And what I do is in the form of these quantitative seminars. Some of you may have attended some of these previously. Has anyone that's on the call now attended a previous quantitative seminar session? You can just type in there if you can. Okay, fantastic. And so we'll go ahead and get started. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start out with objectives. And these objectives, number one, you'll see that I'm not talking about necessarily teaching SPSS, et cetera, but the objectives. What are we trying to attain here? And the first thing that's always my concern is to ease your anxiety about a particular test. You know, we're anxious, we hear the name is confusing, the name can even intimidate us, and we just want to ease the anxiety about this, meaning, we'll go about how we're going to do that. Um, and by doing that, we'll provide a broad overview um, of the concepts and applications of this particular statistical test. Then what we'll do is we'll go and look at how do we conduct this test, um, using the SPSS software. And then I'll provide you with some additional resources to have at your disposal through your Walden quantitative journey. Now, I say quantitative journey because not everyone here may be on the same journey. Some of you may be taking this because, you want to understand this in your coursework. Some of you may be actually implementing something like this in your dissertation or capstone process. Some of you may say, well, I'm not going to use this test, but undoubtedly I need to read a lot of research. I need to read broadly on my topic, no matter if it's quantitative or qualitative. And when I come across a Pearson product moment correlation test, I want to understand what I've read so that I could, provide the right information I need for my critical analysis and synthesis of my literature review. So as you can see, there's a lot of reasons that we would want to understand this statistical test and others. Now, if you would, to keep this a little bit interactive, can you type in, if you'd like to, why you are attending this seminar? Is it for coursework, general knowledge? You're at the stage you're trying to figure out what tests to use. What is your reason for attending this quantitative seminar on, okay, for class, general refresher, general knowledge for the dissertation stage? Fantastic. And all of the above, okay. And that's important because it'll help me, point out some specific things, for everyone, hopefully at every stage, okay? Now, let's go ahead now and let's move on into the next slide, which will talk about how will we meet those objectives. The first thing we're going to do is discuss something called the scales of measurement. Excuse me. And for those of you that have attended some of these sessions before, or have even looked at some of the recordings of previous sessions, you'll see that I talk about the scale of measurement no matter what statistical test that I am talking about. There's actually a seminar dedicated solely to the scales of measurement because you'll see how important it is to understand scales of measurement before you can run any statistical test. And we'll talk about that. And then again, we'll go into the Pearson's product moment correlation test. Why should we use it? What are the conditions for using this test? When would I use it? We have to discuss the data assumptions surrounding this particular test. We'll look into SPSS. We'll look at some of the SPSS output so that we can interpret the results of this particular test. Then we will look at an APA compliant results write-up. After looking at the APA output for a Pearson's product moment correlation, how would I write it up in APA compliant format? So when we leave this session, you're going to have a bunch of resources that I'm also going to put into the chat area. So remind me to do that before we leave. If I haven't told you that I'm putting documents in here and having you check to make sure they're in there, make sure that I do that. And then we'll look at some other quantitative resources that should be very helpful to you in your quantitative journey. We'll summarize what we've done, and then I will point you to an anonymous volunteer survey regarding the session here that you have just experienced, okay? Now, when we talk about SPSS, again, which is the data software that you would be using for any data analysis, every variable in that data set, okay, every variable in that data set, you're going to have to provide a scale of measurement for that particular variable, okay? And as you can see, here is a little mock SPSS picture where I have, some variables here, an email address, the name of a person, and here's a question. But as you can see here in the measure column, I need to know something about the scales of measurement. Now, there are 4 scales of measurement: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Now, however, in SPSS, you will see nominal, ordinal, but you won't see the interval and ratio that I have in the blue arrow. What you will see is scale. That scale will represent either an interval or ratio measurement. So as you can see in that measure column, all 4 scales of measurement are available and need to be selected when you are running the test, okay? Now, we know the nominal scale of measurement is that categorical variable. For example, gender. Gender would be a categorical variable, male or female. It doesn't have any numerical importance. It's just that we need to categorize how many males were in the study, how many, etc. When we talk about ordinal, that's when we start looking at things like Likert scales, in some ranking order. How likely are you to do something? Not likely at all, somewhat likely, neutral, very likely, highly likely, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to understand the underlying structure of your data to make sure you are using the right data for the analysis that you select. And we'll get to the very specifics for the Pearson correlation test here in just a second. But this is important information to understand. And the interval and ratio are the higher level measures. And we don't need to talk about those here right now, but we'll get to that in just a second, okay? Now, give me just a second. Now, when we start talking about the Pearson product moment correlation test, what is it? Why would I use it? Why would I run it? What information am I looking for when I run that test? And what it is this a statistical test, and it determines the strength and direction. So it's 2 components here, the strength and the direction of a relationship between 2 continuous variables. Now notice the words 2 continuous are highlighted in bold because you can only use 2 variables in this analysis. And the strength, when we look at the correlation coefficient, once it's produced, and we'll look at that, it's going to have a value of a -1 to a +1. That's the range. It can't be any higher or any lower. Okay, that negative meaning, a negative relationship, the positive, the plus meaning a positive relationship. So that negative or plus sign gives us the direction. Is it a positive or is it a negative relationship? And then the strength is that number or the correlation coefficient value. And as you can see, anything from like a 0.1 to a 0.29, small, 3.0 to 4.9 medium, etc. large. So we get some indication of how strong it was by the correlation coefficient and also the direction of the correlation coefficient. Let's look at some directions, some examples here. So for example, a correlation coefficient of 0.4 would fall in this range. Now, it's not a negative sign here, so we know it would be a positive relationship, and it's what we would call medium or moderate. Okay, so now when you're looking at a study, at least right now, and you can see the author says R equals, you can now look at this number and know the strength of that relationship, and also look at the sign, be it negative or positive, to know the direction. Okay, does that make sense to everyone so far? Is everyone okay? Okay, now let's take a look at that though now to get a better understanding of that. Let's look at some relationships and now let's try to understand strength and direction based on what we are looking at, okay? Linear relationship is denoted here. As you can see, these are the data points in blue, but the red line is where showing if I were to just eyeball and draw a line that best represented the data, which is the red line, I kind of get an indication of the direction. And it's going from lower left to top right, meaning that's a positive direction. As one variable increases, the second variable increases. That's what we mean. And as you can see, the linear relationship here also, but it's negative. So as one variable gets higher, the other variable gets lower. You can see that we can have a non-linear relationship, which could be curvilinear. Here is a different type of relationship. But as you can see, we can look at output to also get some type of an understanding of the strength and the direction. In the case of height to weight is a perfect example, okay? And it has to be two continuous variables, meaning these variables have to be numeric. Remember, interval or ratio. It has to be a number. So height could be inches, weight would be in pounds. So I could look at the relationship between height and weight. So we would think as one perhaps got taller, one would put on more weight, up to a certain point. You're only going to get but so tall, you see? So that's what you're understanding and looking at when you're talking about strength in relationships. And at this point now, we're not doing anything about cause and effect. This is a very lower level test that doesn't really tell us what's caused what, but we initially start looking at data and we start getting an indication of any types of relationship and what direction it may be and how strong that relationship may be, okay? Now, let's take a look at something that we may be able to look at a relationship between. So for example, you might be interested in examining that relationship between, say, optimism and satisfaction. We would think that the more optimistic one is in life, the more satisfied one is in life, right? And perhaps we would see that positive relationship. As my optimism level goes up, so does my life satisfaction. So this is the way you want to think about the Pearson correlation example. Now notice in green, there's only two variables, optimism and satisfaction. And we know that these variables should be scale or what we call interval or ratio scales of measurement. Now, how would a research question look? Research questions can be stated in a plethora of ways. A lot of time, that's just based on stylistic preference. But a very simple example that would work in any case would be, is there a statistically significant relationship between, and you simply state the two variables, optimism and satisfaction. And you provide the appropriate null hypothesis that there is no relationship between them, and the alternative relationship that there is a statistically significant relationship. Those are the conditions, the way that something should be set up, and the way that questions and hypotheses should align for the Pearson correlation statistical test. Now, as I mentioned, this is a parametric test, and you've probably heard the term parametric, and you've heard the term non-parametric. What do we mean by that? Well, a parametric test is a test in which there are data assumptions that we must assess. The data needs to meet certain requirements for the test to give us valid results. A non-parametric test doesn't work that way, okay? So what are the data assumptions for the Pearson's product moment correlation test? The first one we mentioned is a requirement. It needs to be two continuous, which are interval or ratio scales and measurement variables. If you don't have this, you don't even think about doing the Pearson's correlation test. Now, the thing is that these two, we're talking about design now, these two continuous variables need to be paired. In other words, you need to get these measurements from the same individual. So you are getting my optimism score and you're getting my life satisfaction score. So for each participant, these two scores are paired. And these are the requirements, or as we mentioned in the opening slide, the conditions for which this test should be run. Okay? But now, we met the conditions, but now what are these data assumptions, things that can skew our results, or things that can make it where our results aren't valid or reliable, or we question the results? Those are the data assumptions. And what we assume, and we have to also test this assumption, that the data is linear. Because that's what we're looking for, a linear relationship. And how do we know that? To test that assumption, we're going to run something called a scatter plot. If you look over here in the right in the assessment column. So you'll know that when you get this slide. You will notice too that we need to look for outliers. We need to make sure there's no significant outliers. We know that correlation tests are very sensitive to significant outliers. Let me give you an example. Let's just say we were looking at the salary for all of, say, Apple, the computer company, Apple employees. And we take the average employee who makes whatever the case may be, let's say $100,000 on average. But suppose we included Tim Cook's salary in that data, who probably makes $15 to $20 million a year. You can see how skewed that one data point would be. It would be outliers. It would probably take linearity out of our data. And also, it would probably make it where our data is not normally distributed. So these are the three assumptions that we have to test for: linearity, outliers, and normality. Here they are, clearly listed. And to the right are the way that we assess those, and we're going to look at how we would assess those when doing the Pearson's correlation test. But the first thing is, let's look at what it looks like. When we're looking for linearity, we're going to produce a scatter plot. And as you can see, life satisfaction is on the y-axis, optimism is on the x-axis. And you can see I drew a superimposed line in the data, but as you can see, I'm just eyeballing and trying to approximate the direction of the data. Now the strength, which I can't really tell here, but the strength, let me draw something here, would kind of almost look something like this. If the data was really, really hovered closely and really tight, and most of the data fit inside here, that would probably be a very strong relationship. So we know it's positive. And so here would probably be very strong. Here we may be looking at a moderate. I don't know, but we'll be able to tell more in detail. But the way that you assess linearity is through a scatter plot. The next assumption, remember we said outliers. You will assess outliers through something called box plots, and we'll look at how to do that. And as you can see, I have a box plot for total life satisfaction. I have a box plot for optimism. Notice that in this optimism box plot, I have an 81, I have a 276. These two little circles. Those circles tell me that each one of these cases is an outlier, sitting way out on some end that probably needs to be addressed in one way, shape, form, or fashion. And you can see here that there are two outliers in the total optimism variable, and we could say that the assumption of outliers has been violated. Okay? They are present, and we don't want them present in most cases. Let's look at the third and final assumption, normality. And remember from statistics that, we want the data, a normal distribution is that data that kind of fits that very perfect bell curve, et cetera, type thing. And what we're going to do is to test that test of normality with something called the Shapiro-Wilk test. So we have three assumptions, and we've talked about how we will identify all three of those. Any questions at this point on the data assumptions? Does it make sense of what we're trying to do here and where we're going at this point? Okay, thank you, Valerie. Now, let me see what I have next here. Now, the next procedures here I have, or the SPSS procedures for running the test. But let's take a look now. This is where, give me a second, I'm going to go into SPSS and we're going to look at how we run those procedures for the three tests, okay? So I have to get into SPSS now. So we're going to look at the linearity, box plots, and the Shapiro test. So now, what I'm going to do is, give me just a second. I'm going to shift my screen here and get into SPSS. And now, from what I'm seeing here, you should be seeing an SPSS data file. Yes, no?
Yes, I do.
Okay, fantastic. So now let's just take a second and look at this data file. So for example, I know there's some individuals that said that they're doing this for coursework. And so more than likely, they've probably provided you with a data set, okay? When you open up the data set, you'll see here that you have several views, an overview, a data view, and a variable view. And I'm clicking in the bottom here, and you can see these tabs, overview, data view, and variable view, okay? Now let's look at the variable view. The variables of concern were the total optimism score and the total life satisfaction score, right? These are the two variables of concern. Is there a relationship? Notice that we have here the measure column, and you notice that we said that they both are scaled. You see that? And those are the other choices, ordinal and nominal. So we know now that the requirements are okay because our two variables, satisfaction and optimism, meet the requirements of a scale variable. If we look at the data view, we'll see the numbers now. And look at the optimism column. Those are strictly numbers. Look at the life satisfaction score, scale numbers, 23, 22. So person number one, which you should see highlighted in blue here, had a life satisfaction score of 23, and they had a total optimism score of 22. This is what we mean by paired. This needs to be the same individual. The second individual or case in the data set, the person's life satisfaction score was 30, and the optimism score is 19. So as you can see, we're trying to see, is there a relationship between this column and that column collectively amongst this data set, okay? And what we have in the data set, if I was to go down, you'd see that we have about 439 records or cases in this data file. So you're getting ready to analyze 439 records to see if there's a relationship between optimism and satisfaction. Does that make sense to everyone at this point? How the relationship between the data file and understanding the conditions for the Pearson's correlation. Is everybody okay with that? And how it aligns with what we talked about, the requirements, et cetera, et cetera. Now, so what we said, the first was linearity, the assumption. So you've got your data set, your requirements are met. Does this data meet the assumption of linearity? And we said that we are going to assess that with a scatter plot, right? So where that is, just give me a second. Up here in your top menu, the top line, you see graphs, and you'll see right here, scatter or dot. You would click that, okay? You're going to want a simple scatter plot. You hit define. You have to tell it what, give me just a second here. Let me go back one. Graphs, scatter dot, a simple scatter, and let me define. And what I'm going to do is put in total life satisfaction, okay? And I'm going to put in then total optimism. These are the two variables that I want to see if there is a linear relationship. I simply at this point hit OK. And as you can see, here's the resulting scatter plot. Remember, this is the same scatter plot that we looked at in the PowerPoint presentation. And the line that you saw was the one that I superimposed on there. So someone else may draw a line. It may not be a straight line because you're eyeballing it, but you do see that there is a linear relationship. Okay? Now, the next one we said was box plots. How do we create the box plot? So I'm going to delete this right. So here's a box plot, but I'm going to show you how we create one. So again, it's going to be the graphs, and then you're going to go into the box plot. And again, it's going to be a simple box plot, and you're going to look at the summaries for separate variables because you have two variables. You have optimism and you have life satisfaction. You hit define. And as you can see, I've already put in here total life satisfaction for one box and optimism for the second box. Okay? Let me see what I have for options here. Don't worry about that. Then you simply hit OK, and you look at your box plots. And we know that we have these two outliers. Now you say my next step is to see if I have normality. So we know that this assumption is violated. We know that. Now let's look at normality. And so that would be in the analyze, descriptive statistics, and then hit the explore button, the explore. And let me see, well, there's two different ways to do that. Let me see what version of SPSS I'm in. No, let me hit cancel. Let's just, no, excuse me, analyze, yeah, regression, okay, and linear. And when you run the linear regression process, what you're going to do is you're going to put your dependent variable in here. And let me see here just to make sure. Okay, yeah, give me just a second. Give me a second. I'm shifting between the two versions. This is the newer version, the 29 version. Let me see if that would, yeah. So it would be the explore command, as I mentioned. And what we're going to do is take and put the variables of concern in there. And so we had total life satisfaction, total optimism. Okay. Now the statistics that we want, again, we always make sure we get the 95% confidence interval. Okay. You could also even get outliers from here. Remember, we did it through the box plot way also. But I'll hit continue. But now let's go into plots. Okay. And you can see here the normality plots with test. This is going to give us the results of that Shapiro-Wilk test. Okay, I'll take that off and let's hit continue. And you see the test of normality has shown up here. And that's telling us that both of these are significant, meaning they're less than 0.05, which means they significantly deviate from normality. So that's telling me that this total life satisfaction variable and this total optimism variable, that these variables don't have a normal distribution. So that has been violated. So what we know now is that we have met the assumption of linearity, but the other two assumptions, outliers and normality, has been violated. Okay? Now, at this point, let's stay in SPSS and let's run the linear regression procedure. Okay? And I want you to see something here. We can go into analyze, regression, linear. Okay? No, excuse me, correlate. Bivariate correlation. That's what we're doing. The Pearson's correlation, but it's called bivariate correlations in SPSS. When we click on that, we see that we will put our variables in here that we want to look at that relationship between. And in our case, satisfaction and optimism. Okay? You see here the correlation coefficients, Pearson's is selected. If those assumptions are violated that we just talked about, you have an option of selecting Spearman's. Spearman makes the correction and kind of compensate for that non-normal data. But we're not going to really get deep into that at this point. But so anyway, I'm just going to stay with Pearson's, make sure the two-tail, all these things are selected. Let's see, we'll just forget about all of that. Make sure you always select confidence intervals in any of your work so that we get the 95% confidence interval. We hit continue and okay. And what you'll end up with will be the results of your Pearson's correlation test here and here. Now, you don't know what this means yet, and this is where we're going to go now into the next phase of this so that we can answer the research question. Is there a relationship between satisfaction and optimism? This output right here gives us all the information that we need to answer that research question. Now, what we'll do at this point is I'll go back to PowerPoint, and you should see a PowerPoint presentation. And what I'm going to do is go to the slide now where we are going to look at the output. And these were the two pieces that we looked at in the table, in the output, okay, when we ran the procedure, okay? Now, the first thing you're looking at is the sig value, P, right here. And you'll see that it says that there is the sig value is less than 0.001. That is a significant relationship. But you'll see the same thing here under total optimism, sig less than 0.001. You know that it's significant because it's less than 0.001. Now take a look at the 0.483. That gives us a measurement of the strength. Remember we said it goes from a negative to a positive 1? What would you say the strength of this relationship is and the direction? Anyone want to take a stab at typing that in the in the chat? We have a strength and a direction right here in front of us. Anyone like to take a stab at that to see what that might be? And I also have to find the chat here to see where you are, okay? So if someone is saying a medium, I would say so because it's between that threshold. And you would say a positive. Medium and positive, exactly. And now you can see when you look at the correlation output, you know now that I had a significant medium correlation or a significant moderate correlation. Does that make sense to everybody? That is simply the results of the Pearson's product moment correlation test and what the results mean. Now, remember, we also ran the confidence intervals. Notice the correlation is 0.483. But we also report the 95% confidence interval, meaning that we know that if we conducted this same study 100 times, each time getting a different sample, that 95% of the time that we're going to find this correlation value to be on the lower end, 0.407, which would be this way, and on the higher end, it would be 0.552, which would be on this end. Those are the confidence intervals, okay? So we're pretty much saying we know that this relationship is no weaker than 0.407 in the true population and no stronger than 0.552. Does that make sense to everybody? Or a little bit more sense than understanding of Pearson's correlation may have made 30 minutes ago? Yes, no, okay. Now, let's tie it together here because I see we have a little here, someone saying a little, but now let's put it all together. What does it look like when I write it up? Okay. Now, what I'll do is the best way, I have a PowerPoint slide that you'll be able to look at, when you get the presentation, which is here. And let's take a look at that. Also, I'm going to give you a Word document that shows the same thing. And this is kind of what it would look like. So here we would talk about the tests we conducted, okay? So we would say the Pearson's product test was conducted to examine if there's a relationship between optimism and satisfaction. And in this case, I'm saying among a sample of Walden PhD students, okay? The next thing is you talk about the assumptions that we had to test. So we usually say something like preliminary analysis, or you can say the assumptions were assessed. But anyway, preliminary analysis were conducted to examine the assumptions of, remember, we had 3 of them. And from the scatter plot, we say the assumption of linearity was met. And we would have that scatter plot as the figure. Then we would say, however, the assumptions of outliers and normality were not met. And we give the reader evidence. Figure 2 is a box plot that shows up those 2 optimism outliers. However, just for the purposes of this training, I said these outliers were maintained in the analysis. You may choose to remove them. And then you would simply say, these outliers were removed in the final analysis. You will have to make that decision. Then we give the evidence for the test of normality. And we could say that they were both significant. And remember, they were both less than 0.001. And so what I say in this case, because I didn't remove them and there were some normality issues, I would just say the reader should judge these results with caution based on the preliminary analysis. Now it's a matter of telling the reader what the results were, but putting it in appropriate statistical notation. Now, normally what you'll see is that you'll give us the results of the test. The aura lets us know that it was a Pearson's correlation test conducted. That's the statistical symbol for Pearson's correlation. Then the 435 is a measure of the sample size that was created and used and produced from the SPSS output. And we'll look at that. And it tells us that this sample was for 435 individuals. And the R value, remember, was 0.483 moderate. I just rounded that to 0.48. In here, I put the upper and the lower limits of the confidence intervals. Again, just rounded to 2 decimal places. And of course, the overall correlation was significant. That's how you take that results output and turned it into the APA compliant narrative. So now when you read a Pearson product moment correlation study or results, you should be looking to see if it aligns and you're able to discern this information from the results. Or if you are providing the results of a Pearson product moment correlation test, you should be providing this type of information. Now, just to add a little bit more, we'll say the null hypothesis is rejected and the alternative is accepted. And there is a positive and moderate relationship between optimism and satisfaction. And what that means is that an increase in optimism was moderately correlated with an increase in life satisfaction. Then we always have to do something called the effect size, and that's the coefficient of determination. And what that is just squaring the 0.483, which is the R value, and that comes at 0.23. And that means that these variables share 23% of the variance, okay? That they're correlated in the variance, and so they share 23% of kind of say the same content. If that's a higher variance, they're even probably a higher higher correlated, and you may see your coefficient of determination or your R value is going to probably be higher, meaning even a stronger percent of variance that's shared. Now, what I want to do is to move to one other document here that kind of ties it together. And you're going to get a copy of this, okay? That I'm just calling a Pearson product moment correlation test, an exemplar, application exemplar. And here's just a forward telling you what this document contains. And it is an example of a purpose statement. You see, is to examine the relationship between optimism, satisfaction, the research questions that align with that problem and with that purpose, and the results section that we just looked at in the slides. But now I'm showing you where I have attached the figures that I'm saying give me evidence of the relationship being linear, and I've given you evidence of the box plots and the outliers here. So you see that contains everything that's needed and gives the reader an understanding and an answer to this particular research question here, okay? Right here. Is there a relationship between these two variables? The way you answer that is here. Does that make a little bit more sense to everyone? And remember now, you're going to get copies of this to use to go back to the presentation. I'm hoping that the recording works for this, and I'm able to even give you the link to the recording of this live session, okay? So does everyone understand this, and is this very helpful? So what I want to do now, and give me some confirmations on that, is this helpful here? Okay. Now, the question was, if the outliers are not removed, is the null still rejected? We're getting deep into statistics now, but that's a good question. And I don't want to get too deep into statistics, but there's a lot of things that you can do. And of course, this is how, beyond the scope of this. But for example, you could do something. For example, let's just say that sample size is a premium. We know we'll have to do a sample size calculation in our research, and we need X amount of people. Let's just say we're very close to that amount, or maybe just a little bit short. That may be okay. But now think about it. Do we want to start removing data now when we're very close and may not even have enough sample? Maybe not so. So there are things that one can do. For example, something called a 5% trim the means procedure. And I don't want to confuse you, but you can trim the top 5% and the bottom lower percent of your data, which will take out the outliers. You rerun the analysis and you see how different the results are. If they are not, significant from your perspective, then you may leave the outliers. I don't know. This is where we get a little deeper into statistics and understand, what decisions to make. Now, the other thing is that if you read the exemplar here, did I add something here? Notice here that if the assumption is violated, let me try to make this a little bigger. Okay, you see I have a footnote here. And if you read the footnote, it'll tell you decide what action to take. when the assumption is violated. Now, we just talked about you can remove outliers, you can run the Pearson's correlation test, or there's even another procedure called bootstrapping, which again, that's beyond the scope of this, but I'm going to show you some resources, okay? To kind of remember, we can't do everything in one presentation, but hopefully you're getting a much better understanding of the overall conceptualization and what needs to be done from this 45-minute or hour session. Okay, that's the goal there, and we will have resources for you. Now, yes, Chris, this will be put into the chat here in just a second to remind me again. So no one, please don't log out before I put that in there, okay? But that's kind of the way that it should look, you see? And I put a copy of the scatter plot here, which I said was the box plots, and in the table 1 of my descriptive statistics. This was the mean optimism score and the mean satisfaction uh, um, score, okay? Now, let's take a look at one other thing here. What I want to bring to your attention now are the additional resources because you guys are asking some excellent questions. What do I do with this and this and that? Well, we can't cover everything in one seminar, but if you go out to the ORD's Quantitative Seminars website, okay? And so what I'm going to do now is skip to the ORD's website and show you where this link is going to take you. Okay, it's going to take you out here to our website and to the list of all the quantitative seminars that I have conducted. So as you can see, tonight we conducted the Pearson's product moment correlation. Tomorrow that will move down here into the on-demand quantitative seminar recordings. But you are doing the Pearson's correlation test, okay? You need to understand the scales of measurement. Here's a total seminar on the scales of measurement, okay? So as you can see, getting to this link will give you confidence intervals that we talked about. What is statistical significance? This link will start getting you to a wealth of the resources that you need, okay? So that's the first resource. The next resource on the slide is the scales of measurement, again, which we talked about, but again, you'll find that at our ORD's website. And then for the Pearson's product moment correlation, in addition to this presentation, hopefully the recording and the document, Word document for the write-up, if you were to click on this link, okay, and you get out here to Safari, where it's going to take you, and okay, it should have taken me to give me just a second. Okay, no problem. I'll get right there in just a second. If you click that link, what you're going to go, where it's going to take you is to this home page. What we have just discussed here, okay? And you'll see the conditions, remember, strength and direction of the association, the interval or at least an interval scale, an example, the assumptions, remember, interval or ratio, linear relationship, no outliers, normally distributed, and also an example, how you set it up in SPSS, and the same steps that we follow, correlate, bivariate, put your variables in here. You'll also have this link, okay? So now if you give me a second, please, here, let me get into the chat, okay? Now, the first thing I'm going to do is try to get these documents into the chat, okay? So give me just a second. Okay. Okay, you should see the Pearson product moment correlation presentation now at the bottom. Now I'm going to have the APA results write-up, which was the Word document, okay? Now you should see the Pearson Product Moment Word exemplar document. Do you see those documents? Because I've put them into the chat now, okay? So that's the exact presentation we use, the exact APA results write-up. And also, even though we put it on the slides, okay, I'm going to take and copy, and now I'm also going to put the link to the Pearson's product moment correlation from that website, Leered Statistics, okay? So you have a wealth of resources to get to, a wealth of resources to get to just for this one test. So as we go through these seminars, and tomorrow I'll be doing one on bivariate regression, which is the logical step up from this. We're going to try to follow the same format, okay, of sending you the resources, putting the presentation together, and then finally, what's very critical and what helps me to continue to develop and know what your needs are, which I'll go back to the presentation again. And if you would, I really, really need to hear from you in terms of your thoughts about the session. Okay? Now, I'll show you what that's going to look like when you click on that link. And you'll see, here's the preview. And again, it should take you no more than 5 minutes. But as you can see, what helps me put this together for you, you're going to tell us, answer these questions. You're going to tell me your gender, your age, your college or your school, your degree program, blah, 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 all that information, the stage of your process, you see, and your research methodology you're thinking about, but then questions about, the session. Did it meet your expectations? Things of that nature. And here, the critical piece is in the narrative. Tell me what you thought about this. What could be done better? What was done fantastic? What else would you like to see? I like to say that this quantitative uh, intervention that I am putting together here, I like for this to be driven by the audience it's intended for. And only you, the audience, can tell me, are we on point with this? So that we can know how to develop future sessions for you, okay? So having said that, I'm gonna now go back to the PowerPoint and, there's the survey. And in conclusion here, we've talked about those scales of measurement. And we went through the conditions for this test. Remember, 2 interval or ratio scale variables. We talked about the 3 assumptions, which are the linearity, the outliers, and the normality, and how we assess those. Box plots, scatter plots, and the Shapiro-Wilk test. The presentation shows you how to conduct the test. The recording will hopefully have all that information in it, and we know how to interpret the output and turn that APA output into an APA compliant results write-up. You have links to other quantitative resources, and please take the opportunity to fill out this anonymous survey. Are there any final and closing questions? And again, hopefully, I'm hoping that this session has been very beneficial to each and every one of you. Okay, the link to the survey again is in the main slide, but I will go ahead and give me just a second, get that link again and put it in the chat for you. I'm sure, let me see, make sure. Let me do it this way. And you should check the chat now, and there should be a link to the survey. Okay? Does everyone see that? Okay, so that's all that I have. And again, we definitely don't want to go more than an hour. We know that's too much information to absorb. But again, remember the major objective, and I would like perhaps even a yes or no. Did we ease the anxiety? Regardless of if you know how to do the test or can remember a single thing, did we ease the anxiety around the test? And once the anxiety is eased and we know this is understandable, I can determine what this stuff means, then we've eased that anxiety, and you'll see you'll become much more confident in your quantitative abilities. And you'll see a lot of these same concepts here are the same concepts as we move through statistical tests after statistical test after statistical test. And this will all over time, hopefully, start making much more sense and benefit you during your quantitative journey. Okay? So that's all that I have. I thank you for your time. No, the link to the survey is down there in the bottom. I'm looking at it. So I'm not sure why you don't see it. So what I recommend you do is to save the PowerPoint presentation and just get to it from that link if you're not seeing it, okay? But it's right here in the bottom. I'm looking at it right here. And does no one see the link to the survey there? The last thing that you, well, not the last thing, but some individuals said thank you. But hold on just a second here. You are right. I didn't hit the send button, okay? Thank you very much for bringing that to my attention, link, okay? Now everyone should be, the last chat should be a link, and that's for the survey. Does everyone see that now? Fantastic. So you have everything that you need, and I'm hoping that this session has not been a waste of your time, but have energized you and made you much, much more energized to say, wow, I can really understand this stuff, and I think I can do the Pearson product moment correlation test. Remember, no one's asking you to be an expert. It's a whole lot more to this test than that we could address. That's not the scope and the focus. The broad concepts and the broad overview is what we've addressed here, and that's what we want to make sure you understand. Okay, so thank you. So what I'm going to do now is just leave the session open for a few more minutes. I'm going to back away, but if you need to get any of the documents out of the chat, etc., that I put in there, and in the Q&A, I do see that there was, will you receive a copy of the PowerPoint? I'm going to type the answer yes. It's in the chat. Okay. And I'm still confused on how to determine the independent from the dependent variables. Very good question. There is no distinction between the two. In a correlation test, which is simply looking at the relationships between two variables, there is really no such thing as a difference or between independent and dependent variables. You simply are saying if they are related to each other. Okay? So hopefully that answers the question. So for the Pearson's product moment correlation test, again, there is no distinguishing between independent and dependent variables. One is not dependent upon the other. We're just simply saying that they are highly correlated with each other. It doesn't matter which order you put them in. If you put one in before you put the other in, or one in first, it doesn't matter. You're going to get the same correlation coefficient, the same direction, the same strength. Okay? All righty. So again, I'm going to go ahead now. Hopefully I've answered all the questions there. Let me see in the Q&A. Let me look in here. Yes. Yeah, I've answered them all. One open question again. Okay, you're welcome on that. It's not a question. So anyway, hopefully that helps everyone. I'm going to go ahead now, and I'm going to go ahead and put mine on mute, leave the class open for about 5 more minutes. If you'd like to comment and chat, whatever you can. But I'll go ahead now and end the session. And let me make sure I stop the recording. And let's hope that I can find the recording, because the system is no longer letting us record to the cloud. Our space that Walden has allotted us has been exceeded. So I'm trying now a procedure to save this on my own computer, okay, and get the recording to you. So be patient with me on that process, okay? But hopefully by tomorrow, if you go out to the website, the ORD's website, you should see a link